Thank you, David and David. When we were preparing for this presentation, we were on the telephone, and David Kademas said, and I think he hit it right, he said, probably what your session or your section should be titled is Deferred Maintenance Can Be Managed. We have done it, and I'll share with you some of the techniques that we've used. So this is a little bit of a how-to, and we too are a client of Sightlines, and so there are some pretty good techniques that we have adopted from the Sightlines framework and methodology that I'll share with you today as well. The pictures that you see up here, and this is an important theme that I want to point out. The picture on the top represents what we call a legacy building. It was built in 1932. It happened to be a library at the time, and it had some academic activities in it. It's now principally administrative, but the key is that the picture on the bottom is an academic building, and it has recently been constructed, and the common themes are pitched roofs, towers, collegiate Gothic, red brick, and limestones in all of the openings. What the architects have done is that they have identified the elements that unite the campus, and what they have done in the new buildings, as well as in some of the building renovations, they have tried to repeat those unifying elements, and they've done a very good job at it. I have some square footage numbers that later I'll share with you. The amount of new construction has been significant. And by the way, you don't have to be very smart to figure this out. If you tear down an old building and you build a new one, you put a lot of deferred maintenance away. It's done because those buildings have been decommissioned and gone, and that has been an important part of our strategy. David put this together, and he said one of the things he wanted me to make sure that I emphasize is that the second bullet here is increasing planned maintenance. Those are those dark blue bars, and in fact, our strategy required us to do that. But man, I got to tell you, it took some time to do it. And I'll share with you, number one, how we quantified it, and then again, how we went after those additional dollars and incorporated that into our operating budget. The first slide here, and this is a pie chart. David, you could pop the whole thing up. This is the beginning of the story. In 2006 and 2007, over the summers, our facilities department went into the field and they took a look at every building and every system. So the key to this is that the trade foremen were out into the field and they were taking a look at what are the estimated backlogs, the cost, and they went in by building and they took a look at and made an estimate of what all of those would be. Here's the Sightline methodology that we used. First is that we put the buildings into portfolios, and they're listed as you run from left to right on the horizontal axis. There's a typo, by the way, in there, and I'll describe it because it's really, really important. The legacy buildings are the ones that I described, the 1932 library. Those are ones with interesting architectural value. Everybody has those on their campus. And they pull a heavy load. They're really important to the campus. The Millennium buildings are what we call the newest ones. They are from 1997 and forward. Out of 3.6 million square feet, we have 1.8 million in Millennium. They don't have a lot of deferred maintenance, and in 2006 and 2007, they didn't have a lot at the time, but we nevertheless assessed them. The third column, it says traditional. It's transitional. Transitional. That is a building that we knew we were going to tear down. So when you're going through and you're doing your assessment, you can assess what you think you have in those buildings. Whether you fund it's another story. In fact, if you fund it, you're probably pretty silly. At any rate, and then we had some stuff in parking and non-classified. My point is this, is that you have a good facilities department, the people are in the field, they're taking a look at the buildings and how they're being used. You're using a professional framework and you're making an overall assessment. Our board required that. And here's the thing you won't see on these slides. There's 4 things in my judgment that had to take place at the time we presented this to the board, this assessment. First is that you had to have a chancellor capable of fundraising and a board that was capable of giving substantial gifts and supporting the overall framework. They did. You have to have a compelling architectural vision. We had it. It was defined and it was reflected in that building that was on the bottom of that page. You also have to have the support, in our case, of the academic administration, because the provost is responsible for the development of the budget, the resource allocation. So we can come up with additional needs, but on the other hand, he didn't have to fund them. Well, he bought onto our program. And then the final thing is that you have to have a director of facilities that really knows what they're doing, and they really have to embrace this process. And it has to not only be communication up, but it has to also go into the trades, and it has to go into the individual buildings. Those 4 elements, they're not listed on our slides, but they're all present. Here's the thing about this slide. 145 million, there's no way we could have addressed it. So what we did is we said over a 5-year planning horizon, we basically truncated everything that was in the transitional buildings. That's why I said that was important. You get them all out. We also took everything that was 5 years or beyond, and we truncated those. We took them off. And we came up with $64 million, 5-year planning horizon, $12.8 million a year. The difference between the blue bar and the gray bars represent the difference between the full assessment and the amount we thought that we could fund. Here was the interesting thing about the next page, and this was the actual slide that we presented to the Building and Grounds Committee, the Finance and Budget Committee. Everybody accepted it because the framework was mandated by the Building and Grounds Committee, developed by us, and we presented one recommendation. There are so many uncertainties in everything that I've mentioned. Undoubtedly and invariably, our numbers are wrong. But the point is the board wanted something that they could respond to. So here's what we have, $64 million, and we first categorized it by two components. Core infrastructure, it was our responsibility. And then the programmatic space, the university made a decision. Deans and directors of individual units will have to provide the funding for that. And we have, by the way, then in the way we manage our financial resources, what we call gain sharing accounts or reserves, and they have to draw on those balances that are within their discretion. That was an important part. And obviously the second row is just divide, the first row by 5. The point that I want to make about this, and I'm not going to go through all of the numbers, is facilities management had in their responsibility center, the baseline was $2.7 million. But we have to get, and you'll see that it's under the core infrastructure, so it was our central responsibility to fund. But take a look at the amount in the next to the last row of additive items there. Future year budget additions, it was $4.2 million. We gave the board an assessment, and the board, they knew it, we knew it. We knew we needed more money. How much, and how do you intend to spend it? Well, this quantified at least how much more do we have to add to the structural budget. And I'll tell you, we planned on 5 to 6 years to ramp up over that period of time, number one. And number two, you're looking at a substantial amount of funding every year that would come from decentralized units. That's just part of the culture of the university. So that's how we put this together, and we had to cobble so many pieces together, but we had to do it in a framework consistent with the vision, and it had to be accepted by all of the decentralized units. If you have the provost on your side, that becomes his responsibility. What we wanted to depict, and David, would you go forward 2 slides, please, to the one where we have the Capex first. I wanted to focus on this first, and then we'll just come back to a little bit more detail on the deferred maintenance. The yellow bars represent one-time Capex. It's the new buildings or major renovations. It's mostly new buildings. The reason we have that on there, and it's relative to the $12.8 million, the equilibrium amount that we needed on our deferred maintenance, is that if you're the chancellor and you're responsible for fundraising, and you're doing a lot with new buildings, number one, you'd be kind of nutty to not include that on the charts. And so we obviously measured and assessed and presented the impact of the new buildings. Many of the trustees were involved with the funding of those new buildings, not exclusively by any means, but they were involved and they saw it as well. The important thing in that is, as I was saying, if you're tearing down old buildings, and we did sell a remote campus, it was within the city and county of Denver, but it was about 6 or 7 miles away, and you rebuild new buildings, you make a substantial reduction, if you will, to your backlog. So that was one of the reasons that we were able to take the $145 million and drop it down to $64 million, is that we did not assess the things that would then be decommissioned through the sale. But in only the recent years, we were able to address the full $12.8 million. At the time, the way we were achieving it is by tearing down buildings and building new. David, if you'll go back, and the difference between the next 2 slides that I'm going to go over is that this chart says it tracks performance relative to plan. I think the key here is that the color-coded bars, they stack, and it's the total expenditures per year. It is expenditures by portfolio. And I think the thing that we wanted to point out there, you'll see kind of in the last couple of years, the lighter green column, stacked bar, reflects what we call beneficial buildings. We expanded that legacy. And these are buildings that don't have great architectural value or interest, but they still have an important load for the university. So you know what we did? They became major renovations. And those beneficial buildings, in the major renovations, we added a substantial amount of architectural interest to them. The next page then just shows funding sources. It's dramatic. All of the blue is all collapsed. That's the stuff that we have managed out of our integrated facilities plan is what we call this. But look at all of the one-time money, the additional sources that have been brought to bear, either year-end money from the university centrally to fund a particular or a discrete project. Oftentimes, units come in with money, we add money to it, and dollars that come from decentralized unit gain sharing. I would say if you add up those dollars, you probably have more dollars that have been brought to bear to deferred maintenance from decentralized sources and year-end money, which is very discretionary, than what we have funded out of the base budget of the university. The final thing that I want to show you is something about the discipline. Well, I guess there's one other chart.
What happened to the charts?
I told you, David, they're gone. I'm going to have to describe this. Before I left, I printed these charts, and there were a couple of slides missing, and David says, no, they're not. And so they're right here. And he gave me his slides, but the problem is that they're not on the web. Let me tell you that between 1995, when we went all the way back, when a lot of the new millennium construction started, the campus had an average age per square foot of 38 years. In 2012, the average age is 30. So over a 17-year period of time, the university got 8 years younger in terms of its physical plant. I wish I could say the same for me, but it's phenomenal what selling a campus and building new will do. And along the way, there have been, I think, 83% of the total square footage of campus is either new or subject to major renovation. Final thing, I mentioned these millennium buildings, and there was a comment that, and if you remember Neil Young in one of his songs, I think it was an album, Rust never sleeps. These millennium buildings are going to need work in 20 or 25 years, whether it's, tuck pointing or whether it's new mechanical systems on the inside. And our former chancellor made the comment when we were developing this framework. He said, we will not put any money into these millennium building reserves, which was my recommendation. He says, until we work through the backlog on our legacy buildings. And we not only have worked through, we're still spending money on legacy, but now we're transitioning some of that into these beneficial. But here's the interesting thing that's happening. The backlog is actually working down in legacy and beneficial. And that's because of, I think, the commitment and the proper selection from the facilities department. So the budget is going up slightly, and starting from 2.4 in the base budget to, close to $7 million. So what's happening as area under the line, if you will, which if I had the chart, you would have the base budget going up slightly and then leveling off. There is actually going to be unspent money. We're sending $2.5 million. That's a lot for us. And we're putting those in the Millennium Reserves, and we will do it every year between now through their lifetime. We do not expect a negative draw until 2025. We've modeled all 1.6 million square feet of those buildings. And of course, those numbers are wrong. But when you're putting in $2 to $3 million a year, we will leave a legacy of funding as opposed to inheriting a legacy of deferred maintenance. And that was the key. And our board has embraced that, and those dollars are sitting in the bank today. They're on the balance sheet in reserves, and I expect that those numbers will increase. That has been a pretty successful story. And without the input of all of the people that I mentioned in those 4 bullets that you won't see in here, I'm just the spokesman. But the point is there's been a lot of people who've made this a success in my view.